you just told me you're not attached to the result.
No, I don't relish the idea of being the next president. I've come to realize that more through this process. I think it was true at the start in an abstract sense. I think it's now true in a very practical sense. You learn a lot about the nature of the job over the 6 months of being in this race. I think a lot of the policy prescriptions, even the recent speech on the mechanics of shutting down the administrative state, the speech I'm giving tomorrow about declaring economic independence from China. You learn a lot about what it involves to sit in that seat. And for me, I don't fetishize that. Far from fetishizing, I don't even personally view it as an enjoyable job. We're doing it guided by a different side of our hearts as a family, out of a sense of duty, that this is our way of making a mark on a country that has given us so much, and we're willing to do that. I personally think that we probably shouldn't want someone who relishes that job either, but that's a value judgment for the voters to make, but I certainly don't. And if you told me with certainty that there was someone else who was going to be more effective at reuniting this country and was going to take that job for the next 8 years and it didn't have to be me, my first emotion would be a deep sense of relief and gratitude that were happening. The reason I'm in this race is I don't see that possibility in any person in the landscape today. But if that existed, I think that would be a relief of a burden rather than a competitive threat. We're in this because I think it will take someone of a different generation, of a different mindset. Didn't come from the world of traditional partisan politics. I don't even think of myself as a traditional partisan. I stand for pro-American vision of reviving what this nation stands for. And I see that form of honesty, unshackled by partisan orthodoxy or any other political orthodoxy, is missing in our landscape. I think that's what our country needs. And so we're volunteering to do the job. And, my heart still says we're going to be successful. I don't know for sure where this journey is going to end. Of course, who can? My heart still says that this is our purpose, and I think that this is our moment to step up and do it. I expect we will be successful, but it's not out of personal ambition or attachment to that result that I'm motivated to do it. If anything, it's the opposite. But I think that we have an opportunity to do something for the country that I think needs to be done now. And I don't think we're working within a broad window to get this done either. If our kids graduate from high school before we have revived our missing national identity, I don't think we'll have a country of the same kind left at the end of it. And I think that will be likely permanent. Take generations, if ever, to recover. And so that's what gives us our sense of purpose and urgency, not some sense of personal ambition.
Well, let me ask you this. When you started, most voters didn't know your name, let alone how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
A lot of them still don't. And then you end up sharing center stage at the last GOP debate. Just big picture, what do you think your rapid rise says about the state of politics, and particularly Republican politics right now?
Yeah. So I'll be very frank about this. I am not surprised by our rise. I expected to see the trajectory that we were on, maybe a tad faster than, we might have exactly mapped it on a piece of paper, but that's what pulled me into the race. I traveled the country actually for the better part of the last few years. I've been to a majority of states as part of my book tours and otherwise. And what I saw as I traveled the country was a hunger for an actual vision. Not just, because there's plenty of people who do a good job of this and in various analytical ways criticize what the other side puts on offer. There's the left-wing version of it criticizing the Trumpian right, and then there's the right-wing version of it criticizing the radical left and wokeism and victimhood culture and the dogmas of the Biden administration. And I've done my fair share of that too. But what I saw in the face of my offering that criticism and diagnosis was a hunger for more than that. And the more we were able to point to where we're going, the more I saw audiences across this country, long before I was a presidential candidate, just a step-down CEO from a successful business career, delivering a message of what the American dream actually is or ought to be about. that gave me a sense of confidence that if I was able to look inward and really level that up to a place where we're offering a clear vision of where we're going, that this campaign was going to succeed at a large scale. And so I think that I'm unsurprised by where we are. It's that message that's really guided our success so far. I think whether or not we succeed, ultimately, a lot of that is going to rest with whether I'm able to actually rise to that occasion as a leader who can unite all Americans. I think that the people in our Republican primary base, and I think this is something that's underestimated about our base, we're hungry for national unity, actually. I think it's a different philosophy of how to get there. I think part of how we get there is by being uncompromising about the values that unite us as Americans. But the goal is still to unite this country. And I think that it will be up to whoever leads this party forward. I hope and expect that will be me or whoever's best positioned to do it. But we think it's going to be in this race for that to be me. But I think that that's going to be what determines our success going forward from here.
And we talked a little bit yesterday with Apurva as well about experience and some of the criticism you've received from your opponents. Why go for the top job first? There's an open Senate seat in Ohio. Why not look at that? I mean, you can have a lot of influence, young senator, uniting the party from that direction. Why not look at some of those options?
So I did briefly consider the Senate seat here in Ohio when the Portman seat opened up in 22. And I got a great piece of advice from somebody who guided me early on in that journey to say, hey, anytime you want to look at a job and you want to interview for a job, that's what you're doing when you're running for office. Make sure you understand the job and feel like you want that job and you will excel at that job. And so I did that. I became convinced of a few things. I actually think it is very important to have good people in the role of U.S. Senator, U.S. Congressman. I think it convinced me about the importance of having good state legislators for that matter. But I also became convinced that that was not going to be where I was going to use my unique talents. I'm a guy who builds things. I'm a leader. I've led organizations in diverse spheres of the economy. I don't think that I would be able to use my executive skill set or leadership skill set as part of really a factory for compromise in the way that you put together different pieces of legislation. Now, there's many U.S. senators who don't participate in that either. They do what they do to end up on cable news that evening. That didn't seem like the right way to use that platform as a way to make a public point. I was already doing that as an author of best-selling books and otherwise. I was already on cable TV for that matter. Now, if you wanted to actually do the job well, that involved the process of engaging in a lot of legislative sausage making. And for me, that was not the best use of my skill sets as a leader, though it's really important to have good, earnest people in those roles. And so it's less about that role. If this was about my own political career, my own ambition, maximizing my influence and exercise of power, I'd be going about this very differently, actually.
Speaking of Congress, we are potentially on the verge of a government shutdown.
Yes.
You've said you are in support of what Republicans are doing. You would support a government shutdown if we can't get spending cuts. You know, you've probably traveled this country as much as I have. You've talked to as many, if not more, voters than I have. I spent a lot of time talking to folks, and I'm sure you're hearing the same things that I am, which is that people are very disillusioned. They're really, really tired of seeing the division. They're tired of feeling like nothing is getting done. Mm-hmm. How is shutting down the government not the quintessential example of that concern and a total disappointment for voters?
So I look at it through a totally different frame than traditional Republican versus Democrat short-term tug of war, right? We're always punting the ball to 3-month cycles or 2-year election cycles. Forget about that. I'm not a politician. I'm coming at this from the outside. What are the first principles that define what this country is all about in the first place? We have 3 co-equal branches of government. Those 3 co-equal branches of government are accountable to the people. I think the real rot in our government is the creation of an unconstitutional 4th branch that is doing what the governed never gave them consent to do. Those are the 3-letter agencies from FDA to FTC to FBI to Department of Education.
Right, and I know you want to gut those, but that's not what's on the table.
Well, actually, but it's so philosophically here, what I would say is I am running for U.S. president to proactively shut down much of government. Not because that's an accident or a failure of the system, but because I think that would be the success of a president who governs accordingly. Now, would the way that shutdown that would take place in the back of debt ceiling negotiations, is that the optimal way to take care of the administrative state? No, it'll be messy. It'll be clunky. I don't think that we make our best policies when we have a gun to our head.
Right. So I'm talking about this current imminent
right, but I just wanted to
shutdown.
give you my perspective on that, right? So that's my frame coming in, not a Republican versus Democrat point, but a general skepticism of the existence of much of that federal apparatus in the first place. So if you're like me and you're viewing this through that prism, and then you acknowledge what I think most of us in this country have to acknowledge, that we are on an unsustainable slope of government spending that will cripple our future and our children's future unless we take care of it. No, I don't view a government shutdown, even in that scenario, as some sort of drastic outcome to be avoided. It's not exactly the way I would implement a shutdown as the next U.S. president, and I plan to. But it's not a catastrophic alternative compared to what is the real catastrophe that we're otherwise marching to, which is insolvency of the United States itself. And so that just gives you a sense for why I don't think that that's some sort of disaster outcome that needs to be averted at all cost. I think it's a reasonable outcome if that's what it takes in order to ensure some fiscal discipline.
Well, let me ask
and
you
how
about...
we stay out of our interest payments becoming the largest line item on the federal budget, as it's due to do in the next couple of years unless we change something.
Well, let me ask you about another issue where you've actually been very clear where some of your opponents haven't been, and that's the issue of abortion.
Yes.
You've laid out a very clear position. You've articulated where you stand. You think it should stay with the states. You said you wouldn't sign a national abortion ban. Former President Trump hasn't answered the question about a national bill. Neither has Governor DeSantis. The way that your opponents and much of the Republican Party talks about abortion, considering the midterm losses in 2022 and the role that abortion played there, even the former president has acknowledged that abortion led to some of those losses. Are you concerned about the way that the Republican Party talks about abortion? And do you think that could be harmful to the GOP in 2024 and going forward?
So I have to confess, I'm not a political analyst. I don't aspire to be one. And I think it's important that we as leaders stay tethered to true principle and leave the political analysis to the analysts and leave it to the voters.
You've laid a clear
position
where others haven't.
And that's part of why I think I've been so clear. Mm-hmm. Whether it's my foreign policy or domestic policy, I think one of the things that's different between me and the other candidates, for better or worse, I hope it's for better, is that I believe in clarity. I don't believe in ambiguity. I don't believe in dancing around issues. I believe in being crystal clear about what I'm willing to do and what I'm not willing to do from domestic to foreign policy. On abortion, for that reason, I've been clear about a few things. One is I am pro-life. I believe that unborn life is life. That's part of my personal value system. I am also a 10th Amendment absolutist, and I take the Constitution and the originalist understanding of the Constitution very seriously. And so matching out those two things, I favor laws at the state level that protect life, but I am running for U.S. president. And as the leader of the executive branch of the federal government, I swear an oath to the U.S. Constitution. And though I always keep an open mind on any issue, and I remain and will continue to keep an open mind on this one, I have not seen an iota of a constitutional basis for there to be federal legislation of any kind, either codifying Roe versus Wade into law, which Biden is trying to do, which I oppose, or reactionary Republican efforts to now implement a federal abortion ban after the pro-life movement for years, for decades, has said that the federal government has no place in the question of abortion, which should be a states' rights issue. So I reject hypocrisy wherever it shows up. I'm tethered to the Constitution as a strict originalist, and that's where I land where I do. Now, to your point about how we can talk about this issue differently, I do have views on that. They're not guided by poll-tested slogans. They're guided by my own convictions. I think we need to have sensible conversations about policy in this country relating to access to contraception, adoption, childcare, reasonable solutions that help women get to yes. And then also untapped ground relating to greater sexual responsibility for men in an era of genetic paternity tests that are 100% reliable. There's no reason and no excuse not to share that burden more evenly between men and women of bringing children into this world. And that way, I'm walking the walk when it comes to being pro-life, because I am.
Do you
but
think
we're
the
all in this
Republican
together.
Party is missing an opportunity
Huge
when they're
opportunity.
not talking about
Huge
this?
opportunity missed. And that's why I'm doubling down on highlighting areas where I'll tell you what I see, Dasha, when I travel this country. I also see more people who share pro-life instincts than are willing to admit it. The example I sometimes bring up with friends, and I do have close friends who disagree with me on this issue, even extended family members who will disagree with me on this issue. But I haven't found one American who disagrees with me on this. The case of a pregnant woman walking down the street, she's assaulted. The unborn child dies as a result. You find me one person who says that that violent criminal does not deserve liability for that death. I haven't found one yet. And so that says we share those pro-life instincts in common. There's a life at issue there. But we don't have to make this about men's rights or women's rights either. This is about human rights, and we all ought to be in this together. That doesn't mean we're ever going to fully unite the country around this issue, but it does not have to be nearly as divisive as it has been if we bring from contraception to adoption to childcare to sexual responsibility for men into the conversation as well. And so I'm not guided. I haven't poll tested any of that. This isn't a focus grouped, how do we talk about the issue point? It's a substantive point that if we're really pro-life, let's walk the walk with respect to being pro-life. As the U.S. president, I do support ending federal funding for Planned Parenthood on a number of grounds, number of which is the federal government should not be spending money on funding's favorite pet causes from the federal government regardless. But we've got to be grounded in principle, and we've got to be grounded in consistent moral foundations. That's how we're going to unite this country, not because everyone's going to agree with my pro-life view, even though I think many people share those instincts in common, but because we live in a country where we can have diverse and even deeply divided views and still be one country at the end of it. That's the kind of president I aspire to be.
Let's talk briefly about foreign policy. Ukraine is an issue where the Republican Party is divided. You are one of the candidates who does not support U.S. funding Ukraine in its war with Russia. You've talked about negotiating a deal with Putin that you believe would lead to peace and help cut off the Russia-China relations that you believe are dangerous.
Yes.
But you're also a student of history, which means you've seen historically what happens when you appease strong men. Why do you believe that wouldn't have consequences for global security this time around?
So there's no appeasement at issue here. I want to be very clear about that. The deal that I would do would be a deal that allows Ukraine to come out with its sovereignty intact, which I think there's a very good chance the current trajectory will not lead to right now. Russia has more national interests at stake here than does the U.S. or even much of the rest of NATO. So I think that that's a good outcome for Ukraine to at least have its sovereignty intact. And speaking of history, I am a student of history. I believe that Nixon did the right thing in 1972 when he reopened relations with China to pull Mao Zedong out of the clasp of Brezhnev-led USSR back then. Not because we trusted Mao, not because we were placating or supplicating to Mao, but because we were realists. We understood that the China-Russia alliance then was a real threat to the United States when the USSR was our adversary. I view Putin as the new Mao. The Russia-China alliance now still outmatches the United States, except the CCP is our true adversary like the USSR was in the last century. So if we have an opportunity to pull apart two strongmen dictators, one of whom in particular is hostile to the United States, Xi Jinping, on whom we depend for our modern way of life, then yes, I'll do it. And so to that end, my foreign policy's, back to clarity, pretty clear. Avoid World War III. Number one way we do that is pull Russia apart from China. Declare economic independence from China. I believe that's achievable, and we have and will continue to offer clarity in some upcoming speeches on exactly how we will do that in a way that still leaves America economically strong at home. And then third, secure our own homeland defenses. It's been a long time since our national defense spending has focused on defending the American homeland itself. Nuclear missile defense systems, totally missing. Cyber and super electromagnetic pulse, EMP defense systems, totally missing. Space-based defense systems, totally absent. Border defense systems that are utterly lacking, evidenced by the number of people crossing our borders illegally daily. That's where my focus is. And it's a very clear vision of our foreign policy that's different from the establishment neoconservative view in the Republican Party, and also different from the new model of liberal hegemony embraced by much of the Democratic Party.
Well, this brings me to immigration.
Yes.
you said you want to deport the children of illegal immigrants.
I said the entire family unit.
You said you want to deport the entire family unit of undocumented immigrants.
Yes.
Entire family unit. So let's just be clear about what you mean by that. So someone was born to undocumented immigrants today. Let's say you're president today. You've implemented this policy. They're adults. They work. They pay taxes in the U.S. They vote in the U.S. Maybe they voted for you.
They shouldn't be voting.
Right now,
Yeah.
under current, under law as it is right now, they vote. You become president. The 25-year-old, 30-year-old that was born to undocumented immigrants, their parents and they themselves are deported to say they're from Venezuela. They all go back to Venezuela.
So I want to give you my full perspective on this issue because I will acknowledge this is a difficult question. And what makes this a difficult question is that many people who are in this country illegally are still good people who came here for a better life for their family, in part because of a U.S. president, that's President Biden right now, that gave a tacit and implicit signal that it was okay for them to come. And I think that that's in many ways not their fault per se. It is the fault of an administration that gave them a wink and a nod and said it was okay to come over, that we have laws, but you don't have to follow them.
Right, but there are
and
many
so that's
that
what makes
came
me
under
empathetic.
the Trump administration as well, and under
Many more
Obama and others. There are people who have been living undocumented in this country for a long time.
That's right.
Who have had children, who have grandchildren.
And so I'm using Biden as an example now,
Sure.
but you're right. There have been periods in our history in the last 20 years where we've had ambiguous policy. I want to, however, lead the United States thinking about, similar to the national debt question, on the timescales of history, not on the timescales of tomorrow. And I think the only way we're going to be able to stand as a nation really committed to the rule of law is to behave in a manner that actually means it. So I will not, and this is why I, respectfully interrupted you earlier to say that I will never separate parents from children
Well, you've been very
as a
clear about
deterrent.
that,
But we
of
would
course.
take the family unit and return them to their country of origin as respectfully and
But
humanely
is
as
this a cold
possible.
turkey rip? Like, is it?
It has to
people-
be. But I think that
Okay.
I think that we will provide a path back through legal meritocratic immigration for those who have demonstrated themselves to be law-abiding, contributing citizens of this country.
But to be clear, you're talking about people who only speak English, who have lived in the United States their entire lives, are now going back to Guatemala, Venezuela, to countries that they know nothing about.
So
They
you are
don't speak
picking
the
the
language.
exception rather than the norm in the hard case. But to be frank,
No, but there are
the answer
thousands
includes
of
yes.
these people in the United States.
So I think the right answer is we have to stand for the rule of law. We can't be a nation that says we have these laws, but we somehow turn the other direction to reward the people who broke the law while there are millions more waiting to come here legally through the front door who we say can't come. We can't abide that hypocrisy. And I don't think we can look our kids in the eye and tell them that you have to follow the law if the way our government
people who
itself
right now
refuses
are
itself
considered
to follow the
American
law.
citizens are no longer under
So
Ramaswamy
I want to be very
administration.
clear about this. I think that birthright citizenship does not and should not apply to the kids of parents who entered this country illegally. And I'll give you an example to make that very clear. No legal scholar believes that the kid of diplomats who happen to be born in this geographic space we call the United States of America, someone's here on diplomatic tenure or a diplomatic visit. Nobody in legal academia, in the courts or otherwise, believes that that kid enjoys birthright citizenship.
No, I understand.
And so
that-
someone's here illegally, having broken the law and is not subject to the laws and jurisdiction in the same way, then I think that it is a tenable position for us to take to say that that is also not a birthright citizen guaranteed by the 14th Amendment tied to the original text.
You have an interpretation of the 14th Amendment that you intend to argue, but
Yes.
the reality is, for the last, I don't know, as long as we've had this debate,
And it's
the
a mistake
14th
of the
Amendment has
government.
been interpreted in a certain way, so it is going to be a big shock to a whole lot of people.
I will admit it will be, I will admit that this is a few things. It is a difficult issue.
Yeah.
And there will be a frictional cost
These
in the
children-
short run.
what if these kids
But
have
it's the right answer for the
grandkids?
long run.
What if these children have children? Are their children getting deported as well?
So the way I look at it is, here's the policy we're going to apply. and this is where I've been clear, the kid of illegal immigrants and the families who came here undocumented have to be returned to their country of origin, but we will apply reasonable policies as part of a reformed legal immigration plan to be able to allow the best of them who are contributing to this country and who have otherwise demonstrated themselves to be law-abiding citizens to return through the legal process. But this can't be a system that unfairly penalizes those who are waiting in line to enter this country legally with the illegal migration that we have wrongfully allowed in this country. And I acknowledge that will not be easy, but sometimes we need leaders who do the hard thing, not the easy thing, when we're thinking on the timescales of history and answering who we are as Americans. And part of that is we're a nation committed to the rule of law itself.
And
Everything okay? Okay.
Just time, okay. Time check. I also wanted to, you've talked about, immigration and your own family, right? You and Apurva both,
kids of immigrants.
Kids of immigrants. Apurva herself
came as a young age. Yep.
Came at a young age. You've talked about your mother's experience with the citizenship test. You've also talked about having something similar for folks who graduate high school in order to vote, having a civics test similar to what your mother took. You've lately been talking on the campaign trail more about your mother than your father, and some folks have been asking questions, and I just want to be super clear. Did your father also take the citizenship test, and is your father a citizen?
He did not, and that's a choice that he has made for familial reasons, but my mother did. And I think that every immigrant who comes to this country in order to become a full voting citizen has to do the same. And I believe in being consistent about my policies where...
So your father is not a citizen of the United States?
He's not.
Okay. And your mother, when did your mom take the citizenship test? Was it before or after you were born?
After I was born.
After you were born. Okay.
After years of being in this, following the legal process of becoming a naturalized citizen, she followed it through the legal process. And
so you gained citizenship through birthright then?
Well, but you gain citizenship through birthright citizenship in that sense too, right? I mean, every American. So what I want to do is revive a vision of citizenship where every kid who enjoys...
I'm sorry, just to backtrack. So your father is not a citizen,
They came to this country legally. They were in this country legally. So my view is any kid who is born in this country of parents who are here legally, that's the scope of where birthright citizenship applies. And I think it's a very simple principle. The 14th Amendment says, subject to the laws and jurisdiction thereof. So anybody who is in this country legally, under the auspices of federal law and under the auspices of U.S. law, here legally, the kid of that person, whether they've been here for 5 generations, I don't know if that's your case or not, whether they've been here for 3, 4, 5 generations.
Too, actually, by the way.
Okay, I didn't know that. But anyone who is in this country legally.
Legally.
Yep.
Legally immigrated to the United States.
So the kid of anyone who's in this country legally, whether or not they're an immigrant, that's the scope of to whom birthright citizenship applies. Now, I favor going one step further with this, though. The step I favor going further with is, I think even the kids who are here, whether they're first generation or 6th generation, should have to earn all of their civic privileges by knowing the same thing about a country that we require of legal immigrants as well. I think every 18-year-old who graduates from high school should have to pass the same civics test that every immigrant has to pass in order to become a legal voting citizen. I would also, in our legal immigration system, even bring that citizenship test to the front end, not just on the back end of being a citizen, but even to get a visa to come into this country. I favor making English the national language of the United States. That's important because if we're a nation founded on ideals, we have to be a country that is able to converse in those ideals as well. So that's, I think, important elements of reviving our national identity and our national civic spirit. That's something we're missing. I look to even allies in other parts of the world, places like Israel, a good friend of the United States. I would love to learn from Israel in so many respects, not just their border defenses and their missile defense capabilities, but a strong national identity that even our allies enjoy that we're now lacking in this country. And I think that's what gives a lot of agita to people who are concerned about immigration, understandably, to say that might this erode our national identity? Well, I think we have to have immigration policies that, first of all, protect and advance the interests of those here in the homeland. I think that's the sole purpose of immigration policy. At first, that might sound controversial to some, but it's actually intuitive when you think about it. The purpose of any policy, including our immigration policy, should be to advance the interests of Americans in the homeland. It turns out that I think we can have immigration policies that do accomplish that, bringing in skilled workers who are committed to this country, who speak the national language, who know something about the country. But that's my vision of citizenship. So much so that even the kids who were born here, I favor actually reviving those civic values and ideals as well. And so, yes, I call myself an American nationalist. I mean that in a positive sense. But the revival of national identity is core. It's a core pillar to how we're going to revive this country.
I want to talk about one issue that was brought up at the last debate that I think a lot of folks wanted a little bit more on, and that's the issue of climate.
Yes.
You said that more people are dying of bad climate change policies than they are of actual climate change. What specifically are you referencing there, and how many people have died of bad climate change policies?
Well, it's incalculable, but how many people are actually dying of lack of access to energy? Far more people than are dying of heat waves or weather-related events. So I'll give you a couple facts. There is a 98% reduction in the climate disaster-related death rate over the last century.
But what are you specifically referencing when you say people are dying of bad climate change policies? Like, that's the part that I think people aren't clear on.
Well, reducing access to fossil fuels around the world. I mean, the fact that much of the third world does not have access to fossil fuels, much of which come from countries like the United States when we're net exporters of energy. Yes, people are dying as a consequence of the constraints that we're applying to fossil fuels. Even if you look at the people dying in Europe this summer, there's an article written about the fact that people are dying of heat waves in Europe. Well, the fact of the matter is that's because of the constraints that Europe has applied to the use of air conditioning units in Europe. And this has been undisputed, reported in the press and otherwise. So I want to give a few hard facts that I think can help ground this discussion. 8 times as many people today die in the world today as a consequence of cold temperatures rather than warm ones. The right answer to all temperature-related deaths is more abundant and plentiful access to fossil fuels. There's a 98% reduction in the climate disaster-related death rate over the last century, again owing to technology powered by fossil fuels. For every 100 people who died in 1920 of a climate-related disaster, heat wave to hurricane, that number is 2 today. We are now adopting policies that are constricting the use of those fossil fuels, which account for exactly our adaptation to changing circumstances.
Okay, but
and I think that's wrong.
A Harvard-led research study showed that fossil fuels killed more than 8 million people per year.
That sounds to me like total garbage. And in fact,
Harvard,
but this is the problem. This is the problem with the climate debate, Dasha, if we're being honest about this, is this knowledge synthesis ecosystem relative to the underlying facts has completely betrayed the truth. And this is why somebody with my training, with my level of familiarity, I mean, I would encourage everybody to read the books I have.
Stats like the cold weather, yes, of course.
That's a hard fact.
No, it is a hard fact.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that climate change isn't killing people.
Well, I think it's worth understanding.
That's a very simplified way of approaching the climate issue. Climate change means extreme weather. So yes, people are dying of cold. People are dying of heat.
But then I address the second fact, which is that there's a 98% reduction in the number of people who are dying of people extreme weather-related events.
Living in homes and
powered by fossil fuels. And so this is actually the ultimate irony. And so why do I call the climate...
But fossil fuels are also leading to the heating of the Earth's surface temperature.
In a manner that I think has a minuscule impact on human prosperity. So does it have some impact? Yes. Is it minuscule compared to the impact of denying access to fossil fuels? Yes. And this is where the rubber hits the road. The climate agenda, this is why I call the climate change agenda a hoax. Mm-hmm. I think it has nothing to do with the climate. I think it has to do with letting China catch up to the United States. Because otherwise, Dasha, the very people who are opposed to burning fossil fuels in the United States turn a blind eye when we shift those same fossil fuel projects to places like China. That doesn't make sense.
Vivek, look at the trends of the...
Temperatures are up. I'm not disputing that. I mean, and by the way, there's a couple of facts. The very people who are proponents of this being a problem now, you might recall some of the studies on this. In the 1970s, argued that the climate change we should worry about caused by fossil fuels was a global ice age.
Science has developed.
Well,
your views have developed. Your views have changed from a year ago, right? On COVID,
not on this issue.
On all sorts of issues.
Well, I believe in responding to facts as they change. So I think that's good, but we should stay tethered to the facts. And I think the facts on this are that the existential threat to humanity. I mean, read Steve Koonin. He is a physicist in the Obama administration in the U.S. Energy Department who has been open, and he is not a right of center guy or anything else, about the fact that the incremental change in temperatures over the next century do not threaten humanity in the scale that's claimed by the people who are proposing these policies. Another little mystery that helps reveal what I think is the farce of what's going on here is that the biggest opponents to the use of fossil fuels in the United States are also among the biggest opponents to the use of nuclear energy in the United States.
That's not true. There are a lot of environmentalists, there are a lot of activists that are climate change activists that are very much in favor of nuclear energy. Well, what I say is they're among them,
but there's an intersection here. The biggest opponents to the use of fossil fuels, say exactly what I said, are among the biggest opponents to the use of nuclear energy. That is a hard fact in this country.
And that is changing, Vivek.
Well, it better change because frankly, it takes voices, heterodox voices like mine. When I was saying this 2 years ago, was far more heterodox than it is today. But that's why we have to be willing to talk about these facts in the open.
Because people are seeing the increasing threat of climate change.
Well, I think people are also seeing the increasing promise of nuclear energy and how actually destructive the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been to the construction of
Because people want to get away from the use of fossil fuels and look to clean
energy. But also
energy.
because we need more abundant access to energy, which is lacking today. So, I view that fracking, natural gas is arguably, I view natural gas as a form of clean energy. So the fact that we're describing natural gas, or there are coal plants closing in southern Illinois that just emit water vapor as their byproduct, this is a farce. And so I favor all forms of energy production here in the United States. That includes oil, that includes natural gas, that includes coal, which is far cleaner than it used to be 60 years ago, as well as nuclear energy. I'm also an environmentalist when it comes to clean air and clean water. I think the fact that the East Palestine disaster right here in Ohio, not far from where you and I are sitting, did not get the attention that it deserved was precisely because it did not fit the climate narrative. And so I favor human flourishing, human prosperity. Let's measure human health. Let's measure human wealth and prosperity rather than how much carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere. Let's instead measure how we're impacted as human beings. And that's just a fundamentally different shift. Does that mean that I reject every policy that somebody adopted because it was pro-climate, such as those who might favor nuclear now? No, of course not. But I favor human flourishing and human prosperity being the standard, not how much carbon we emit. I think we have to let go of this anti-carbon cult and instead embrace a pro-human and particularly American flourishing agenda. That'll be my job as U.S. president.
And I know we don't have a ton of time, so this is one of the topics that came up at the debate. Obviously, last debate, you stole the spotlight. You took some shots. You also threw some out. What is going to be your strategy at this next debate?
So, to tell you the truth, my strategy is similar to what it's been for this entire campaign. Speak the truth, be uninhibited. I don't like going in as a prepped politician. I think that in some ways that's part of what's broken about our system.
You going to prep with tennis again?
I might. I'm in a better mood when I'm playing tennis. But I do think that what people are hungry for, especially young people, but I think it's true of all people in this country, hungry for candor, for frankness, for honesty. Share your true convictions. Don't be afraid of the consequences of saying something that you're not supposed to say or saying it in the wrong way. I think that candor is part of what we're missing in the United States today. I think that an element of that is what allowed Trump to succeed in 2015 and 2016. However, I want to do it in a way that also reunites this country. I think we have an opportunity to do it. And so one of the things that I am focusing on as we enter the next phase of this campaign is part of what guided me into this campaign was a mission to reunite the United States. I think that opportunity exists. I think the way we're going to get there isn't by showing up in the middle and trying to do a partisan compromise. I think it's by uniting all Americans, not just some Americans, by actually speaking openly and candidly, not because we're going to agree on everything, but because we're committed to the idea that you get to speak your mind as long as I get to in return. That's our path to national unity. But I do think it's something I remind myself of every day, that that is the mission. And everything that I say and do has to be oriented towards our goal over the next 8 years from the White House, reuniting this nation. I believe we can do it. But I do think that especially as we enter this next phase of the campaign, that's going to be front and center on my mind. Not compromising on what I say, but still preserving that clearly as the goal for why we're in this.
Well, and I think if we could just get a couple more minutes, because I do want to get to the bigger picture around this, and I want to give you a chance to sort of give a little bit of the theory to what it is that you do
Yeah.
and how you do it. Because, you have stoked some controversy. And when you stoke conspiracy theories around 9/11 and January 6th, when you say things like, calling a black member of Congress modern grand wizard of the KKK, when you say those things, and I don't want to get into a debate about them because I know you've had plenty of those with other journalists, but what is the goal when you say those things? Like, what are you trying to achieve?
So I also, have talked about this plenty and don't care to delve into the content, but having mentioned it, I think it's important to understand what I'm describing in cases where I'm talking about Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11. That's not a conspiracy theory. That is hard fact based on declassified documents in 2021 that I refuse to sweep under the rug. When I look at what was racist about the KKK, it was the presumption that you couldn't have an independent opinion because of the color of your skin. So if somebody else says the same thing today, even under different auspices, that doesn't change my disagreement with that view.
Sure.
And so what's my goal in opening up these conversations?
But when you say stuff like that, you're smart.
I know it's going to be controversial. I know it's going to be controversial. So I think it is healthy for our country to have open, radically honest and candid conversations. I think the best measure of our country's health, Dasha, it is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. Right now, we are doing poorly. I see a gap in my own life, in the people, and I'm sure most people watching this would agree with the same thing. There are things that people will say in private that they refuse to say in public. I think that's an indictment of our civic health. So yes, part of what I am doing in this campaign, part of it, is to air. Let's have it out in the open, what we will otherwise say in private. And I think the path to national unity runs through that level of radical candor. Think about in corporate America a few years ago, when I was in corporate America, in the wake of George Floyd's protest, it became a trite slogan. Let's have an honest conversation about race. Anytime somebody says, let's have an honest conversation about race, what do they mean? You read from the approved talking points, shut up, sit down, and do as you're told. I refuse to abide by that. Let's actually have an honest conversation about what it means to be an American, about race, about climate, about what actually happened in the foreign wars that we've entered on false pretenses.
Well, your wife
and I think that's going to help reunite us as a country. That's what motivates me, even though the path is a little bit different than others who earnestly care about national unity, to think the way you get there is by speaking in a genteel way, by sweeping some of the past under the rug and say, hey, let's compromise and move on. I understand that view, and I respect good people who hold that view. But if that was going to get us to national unity, we would have gotten there already. I think we're going to have to take this path of radical candor, which is what I'm bringing to this campaign.
Your wife said you really like to debate, and I see that in you. Like, I know. Like, I feel like I know you because I know I have a lot of friends.
You know the type.
I have a lot of friends like you. And you said at one point in one of your gaggles with the embeds, you said, sometimes I just, in response to saying Elon Musk was going to be one of your advisors, but you said you hadn't sort of directly talked to him. You're like, I just sometimes like say things off the cuff. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, like, how much do you mean what you say? And by that, I'm not questioning your convictions, but like, how much do you literally mean what you say when you say things? Because sometimes it feels like you just kind of like say things.
Well, I think that you can't have it. None of us can have it always, right? You can't be radically candid and then also filter what you say when overly strategically, because then at that point you're playing the political filter game. So I'm on the things that matter. I am sharing my honest and true convictions. Okay. Now, if somebody's asking me about my conversation with Elon Musk or what kind of people would you want as an advisor, I'm giving that off the top of my head. It's an honest response. But does that mean that we had a 5-week plan that we put together and who my advisory council is going to be? No, and I didn't pretend it to be either. But I think I'm glad you're bringing that up because it's an important way for people in this country to understand me in the different forums where I'm speaking. If I'm giving a serious speech about shutting down the administrative state, as we did recently, and I say we're going to fire 75% of the federal employee headcount, and here's the plan for us to actually do it. Yes, I actually mean what I say there. We intend to follow that through. In other cases, I also believe in moments of levity that are honest, that open up candid dialogue. I'm not saying things I don't mean, but that doesn't mean that that's a bedrock part of my policy agenda to drive forward either. Take the 9/11 comment. I haven't brought up 9/11 once on my own in this campaign trail. But if a journalist, and this time it was actually a comedian / journalist who first asked me about it, said, do you believe everything the government has told us about 9/11? The answer to that question is no. Why would I believe the government when the government declassified documents 20 years later that contravened what it said 20 years earlier? Does that mean that's a major policy priority of mine or priority in this campaign? Absolutely not. I think that we have to have stable relations with Saudi Arabia going forward. But I think that's something people need to understand about me. Candor is important.
You're not necessarily
Not everything I say is a policy priority, but that also means that part of what I'm doing is, politicians are coached to speak. When somebody asks you a question you don't want to answer, pivot to talking about your 5 policy priorities. I don't do that. And I understand why they're coached to now. Because
that's very Trumpian
I really do.
Too, right? Someone was talking about Trump and said, don't listen to what he means, not what he says literally. But that can also get you into trouble. I mean, Trump is literally now has been indicted for things that he has said, a perfect phone call where he says, find me 11,000 votes. He says, I was just saying, I think there were 11,000 votes. Other people say he was trying to overturn an election, right?
Well, I do think some of these prosecutions are wrong for multiple reasons.
For you, I'm saying, do you worry about saying things off the cuff that people will take seriously?
I think there are different contexts. I think there are different contexts where you wear different hats, right? If you're joking, if you're having a conversation amongst levity, you're trying to build up an open conversation, invite people to engage in a debate in a podcast or otherwise, and I've probably done more podcasts than any other presidential candidate in history.
It is your thing.
And I think that's useful in reaching young people, and you don't want to have a filter, but nor are you claiming that is your policy plank for how you're going to govern on every particular issue. One of the things I actually do that's a little bit different than a traditional politician is at times I like providing the best articulation of the other side's view as a way for all of us to play devil's advocate. And I see in a primary process, one of the things that you sometimes then see happen is people will literally splice something you said, take that out of context, and then talk to the Republican primary base and say, this guy believes X, when in fact it was in the context of stating even the best argument for the other side. And those could be reasons why someone in my shoes would say, hey, I need to do things differently. But I'm not going to do that. Part of what I'm doing is changing the way this game is played through a level of radical candor and honesty that I think in our foreign policy will lead us to be more successful because our allies and adversaries alike will know we're being candid. But also the American people will have a rebuilt and renewed trust in our own institutions here at home because they know they're not being lied to. And I do think that it's a different vision. I will admit that. It does come as a bit of a shock to the system. But at a moment when the system operates the way that it does, I think a shock is a good thing, not a bad thing, as long as it's delivered by somebody with the right intentions for where we're taking our country. And that's what I do believe I'm bringing to the table.
I know we got to wrap things up here, but I do just want to ask you this question that I think is confounding so many people and is a fundamental question for you and your campaign. Look, the Republican establishment wants to move on from Trump. There's been so much money, a record amount of money spent in this primary from your Republican opponents, from super PACs, from tons of donors trying to yank the base away. He's still leading in all of the polls, nationally, in state polls. The base doesn't seem to want to move on. NBC News reporting, the embeds that have been following you around, they go to your events. A ton of the voters at your events say they like you. They're voting for Trump. He's been blamed for down ballot losses in 2022, and yet no budge. Why do you think he's such a massive mountain to climb? Why is he still so unstoppable?
I think that, as I've said it on the debate stage, I stand by it. I think he was an excellent president. I believe in judging a presidency by its results. I think he was the best president of the 21st century. So I understand the attachment to him. But I think that as Americans, we don't just aspire to normalcy or to a version of the past. We aspire to excellence, to be better than we've ever been. And I do think that I will be able to convince the America First base that I'm part of, that I'm best positioned to actually lead this nation forward because I can reunite the country and go even further with our own agenda than Trump did. And I think we're doing that slowly. And even if you come to those events, you're right. Many people will ask me, and I'm the number 2 choice for an overwhelming portion of the America First base, many of whom show up. But we'll get a handful of them That'll show up at every one of the events, and some of the embeds will probably tell you the same thing, who come up after. They'll swap out a truth hat for a Trump hat. They say, you convinced me today. And that's why I'm spending more time on the ground in Iowa and New Hampshire and other early states. Certainly those two states I've spent more time than any other candidate. I'm not taking the voters for granted. 6 months ago, as you said it, people didn't even, 5 months ago, 4 months ago, most of these people didn't even know who I am. And so the fact that we're that far along now, just 4 months later, says to me that I believe we're on a trajectory to win. And I say this as somebody who, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm not attached to the result.
Yeah.
If you told me there was going to be somebody who does this job better of reuniting this country and leading us forward, I'm at peace with that. My job is to make sure the people across this country know who we are. I say we as a family know who we are and what we stand for. And if everybody knows that at the end of this process and they decide to go for somebody else, I'm at peace with that. But my gut instinct is if we succeed at that, I'm going to be your next president and lead our nation forward. And we're volunteering to do that for the next 8 years.
Putting Trump and truth together is also interesting because Trump has a tenuous relationship with the truth, and voters don't seem to really care about that. I mean, your campaign slogan is truth. Do you think that's what people want, or do they just want a champion like what they see in Trump?
So I think there's a few different choices of what voters could want here. And one of those scenarios is going to result in me being the next president. Two others may not. One scenario is, do you want just a basic restoration of normalcy? Compromise on a few things. Let's have a right of center way of thinking about the economy, the budget, taxes, but get back to normal in this country. There'll be other candidates who can offer that incremental reform better than I will on my platform. I think there may be some who say, hey, we need to pummel the other side into the ground. That is our goal. Dig their grave, put them in there, and then bury them because we're in the middle of a crisis, wartime situation, and that's the only way that we win. I'm not the candidate to do that either. Mm-hmm. There was a stage a few years ago where I might have been in that headspace. That's not where I am now. When I was writing some of my books, I was exploring whether that's the right answer for this country. I don't think that's the right answer. Where I'm leading us is to say that the ideals that unite all of us as Americans, they're not moderate ideals. They are radical ideals. Free speech, self-governance over aristocracy, a real commitment to the rule of law. Yes, these are radical ideals, but they are the ideals that unite all of us as Americans. And I'm in this to revive those American revolutionary ideals, those 1776 ideals, not a moderate version of them, not a rated PG version of them, but the original version of those ideals that we fought a revolution to secure in this country. Those are grounded in truth, undeniable truth. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That's what Thomas Jefferson said the first time before Benjamin Franklin edited it to say self-evident. That's what I'm in this to revive. I believe we live in a 1776 moment. I mean that in a positive way. And I think people across this country are ready for it in ways that take off Republican or Democrat or black or white filters. And if I'm right that that's what the people want, then I will be the next president and we will govern accordingly and reunite this country. But that's why I'm in this race. That's where my convictions are. And as I said, it's my job to let the people of this country know who I am and what I stand for. And I believe that's what the voters are going to go for. But that's their choice, not mine. And I'm deeply at peace with that. My heart says we're going to be successful. And if we have this conversation in 6 months, it'll be fun to see where we stand.
Indeed. All right. I think they're all going to kill me now. So I'll let you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.